Three kinds of parallels we can talk about. The first we've already talked about: ancient Near Eastern wisdom. Okay? So we looked at all these parallels from Mesopotamian texts, and we saw that they are in some ways quite similar. Now there are distinctive differences. In the ancient Near Eastern texts, typically the sufferer's suffering is because of a specific sin, or the cause of his suffering is unknown. Whereas in Job, of course, Job is declared to be righteous. So that's a big difference. You also have in the ancient Near Eastern texts much more focus on ritual types of worship as a way to appease the gods, like the exorcisms that we saw in Ludl Bel Nemeki. Whereas in Job, these kinds of ritual actions don't occur at all. There's no reference to making sacrifice except at the very end where God demands a sacrifice of the friends. But in the dialogue, there's no reference to any kind of ritualized action or anything like that. So there are a number of differences, but the big thing that I tried to stress is that in ancient Near Eastern wisdom, you have this upholding of this common sense sort of way of defending traditional morality. God is always punishing the wicked. God is always rewarding the righteous. If you don't see it, don't worry, it's going to happen soon. Don't undermine traditional morality. And as I said, that is in fact the counsel of the three. When I speak of the three, I mean Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. That's the counsel of the three. So surprisingly, ancient Near Eastern wisdom has its closest parallel to Job in how the three represent traditional wisdom. So that's the first broad category. The second broad category is general biblical genres. Then there will be a third surprise that I'll get to in a moment. And the third one is very important, but I'm going to hold off on that. But let's look quickly at some general biblical genres that have parallels in the book of Job. And I'm just going to hopefully kind of quickly get through these just to illustrate the fact, again, when I speak of the difference between wisdom literature in the Bible and election literature, I don't mean they don't know about each other, or that they don't sympathize with each other, or that they don't agree with each other. And in fact, in terms of genre, they have a lot in common. And so let's look at some of these very quickly. 1. The lamentation poem. You know, this is a poem in which the poet laments either his personal suffering or the suffering of his people. And you obviously have a lot of parallels to this elsewhere in the Bible. Psalm 22, you know, the psalm that begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you have all this terrible suffering of the psalmist that he lays out. You know, strong men have surrounded me, the bulls of Bashan, and so forth. Or you have the book of Lamentations, in which the poet laments the suffering of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem. And you know that Job is filled with lamentations spoken by Job personally, such as you were just reading Job chapter 3, you know, the chapter where he curses his birth and he begins talking about how horrible his life has become. So that's a classic lament, the cursing of the birth in Job chapter 3. A second general genre that you have in the book of Job is the hymn. A psalm, a song in praise of God that in some way extols his power and talks about the fact that he punishes the wicked and so forth. So, for example, Psalm 97, the Lord reigns, let the earth rejoice, let the coastlines be glad. Clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes before him and burns up all of his adversaries all around. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before him. So this is Psalm 97. If you've been reading the book of Job, you see a lot of material like that in Job, such as Job chapter 5, Job 26. Don't worry about writing that down. Just making the point that there's parallels. The proverb. A proverb is, of course, a short, pithy little statement that establishes some important truth. And you have Proverbs in the book of Job, and of course you have an entire book that is filled with Proverbs, which is to say, the book of Proverbs. So, for example, just to grab one quickly from the book of Job, to illustrate the point, we have Job chapter 5. I can't find it. Verse 2. Surely vexation kills the fool, and jealousy slays the simple. Now notice that's a very traditional type of proverb. It's a bicolon, two lines that are in parallel. Vexation kills the fool, jealousy slays the simple. And you have other proverbs as well. You have the notion of, fourth, prophetic inspiration or a vision. The prophetic inspiration or the vision. You have these, of course, in the books of the prophets. Often you will have specifically a prophet describing a vision he had, like Ezekiel chapter 1, when the prophet sees the vision of the glory of Yahweh. But you also have a very interesting text in Job chapter 4, where Eliphaz describes a nightly visit, a visit that came one night via spirit. Now we're going to talk about that. That's an important text. But Eliphaz claims to have had a vision, a kind of prophetic encounter with a spirit. But then, of course, you have the great revelation to Job himself, when God appears to Job and speaks to him in chapters 38 to 41. Fifth, you have the wisdom poem. Now, a wisdom poem is, just as the name implies, it is a poem that describes or portrays wisdom. The great wisdom poem of the book of Proverbs that I've alluded to is Proverbs chapter 8, where Lady Wisdom is the focus. In Job, it is Job 28. Where you have this great and significant and somewhat mysterious chapter that talks about how people dig and delve for gold and for jewels, but they cannot find wisdom. So you have the wisdom poem. 6, the numeric saying. The numeric saying. This is simply a saying that employs some kind of a numerical pattern. Now you're very familiar with this from Proverbs. For 3 things and for 4. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that he abominates. That's a numeric saying. You have similar type things in the book of Job. For example, Job chapter 5, verse 19. He will deliver you from 6 troubles. In 7, no evil shall touch you. Again, Job 5:19. He will deliver you from 6 troubles. In 7, no trouble will touch you. So that's the numeric saying. 7, reflective questioning. Now in Job, that's virtually every speech of Job, in which Job is wrestling with hard truths. Things are not the way they ought to be. Job does not understand why God is treating him the way he is. He doesn't understand why all these calamities have come upon him, and he's trying to figure it out. And so that's reflective questioning. The greatest parallel to this comes from another wisdom text, which is, of course, Ecclesiastes, where you will often have in Ecclesiastes statements about, I saw this, and I considered, and I thought, and I said. And so you have just wrestling with issues, wrestling with problems. Eight, what one scholar calls a concealed catalog. Hope you can read that. Concealed catalog. By catalog, we mean a list. And the list may be actually not all that well concealed, and not concealed, it'd just be very, very upfront, very clear. Sometimes it's a little more obscure and a little more artfully woven in. But you will have passages where a whole lot of things will actually be listed out. For example, in Job chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. Let's see. 3, 1 to 9. I will begin in verse 2. Let the day perish on which I was born, the night in which I was conceived. A man was conceived. Let that day be darkness, may God not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep dwell upon it. Let clouds dwell upon it, and blackness of the day terrify it. Now, just reading that far, what have you noticed? The words that are used, day, night, darkness, gloom, light. He's playing with all of these specific words that relate to light and darkness. And so it is a catalog, a list of all these different things. And you find many of these kind of texts in the Bible where there will be sometimes, for example, a list that the sins that the wicked commit. He devours widows' houses. He is violent. He lays a snare for people. He lies with his lips. And it'll be just a long list of the sins that the wicked commit. So it is a very common motif in the Bible. In fact, I encourage you to look for it more and more. You'll see in many passages, if you read it carefully, the author is developing a whole catalog of a certain idea or type. In the beginning of Job, it's light and darkness. And Job, of course, when he's cursing the day of his birth, he wants darkness to overwhelm everything again. Other lists have different purposes. The last one we'll mention here under general genres is the idea of the trial. The trial. And this is the idea of a man and God being at court against one another. God is accusing a man or a nation, Israel, of certain sins, and they're asked if they can offer a defense. So you have, it's often, those of you who've studied this, it's often called the reeve, from the Hebrew word reeve, the reeve motif, which means basically the conflict motif. But it's the idea of God accusing, usually it's Israel, and Israel is asked, is as it were put in the dock, put on trial, and testimony is given against them, and they're asked if they can say anything in their defense. Well, of course, God, in the book of Job, Job takes this up frequently. and declares how he wishes he could stand before God and make his defense, that he could prove that he is righteous, that he has not deserved what's happened to him. And so that is a standard motif that is widely used in Job. Now, my point here, apart from the fact of just hopefully giving you a better sense of the literary power of the book of Job, my point here is to say, again, the book of Job is not isolated in any sense from the rest of the Bible. It partakes heavily of this literature. It draws upon it. And so it is a very, very richly engaged text, so to speak. But now I want to come to my third broad category. The first was, again, genre as it relates to ancient Near Eastern text. The second was how closely the Bible, or the book of Job, is aware of the other genres of the Old Testament. And the third one is perhaps quite surprising: Job as an apocalyptic text. I think the way I'll approach this is I'm first going to point out to you the similarities between the book of Job, and here I mean biblical apocalyptic texts, especially Daniel and Revelation especially. The similarities between the book of Job and these texts. And then I'm going to draw out why I think this is significant. So what is the relationship, or what parallels can we draw between the book of Job and apocalyptic literature? First, I guess I'll summarize it just with the words 2 levels. Apocalyptic literature deals with reality on 2 levels. The earthly level, the level that people see around them, and the heavenly level, what's going on with God in heaven. On the earthly level, evil has triumphed. Everywhere they look around them, the wrong has won, and virtue is being stomped into the ground. On the heavenly level, God is in control of all things, and He is drawing all things to the right conclusion. So to put it in simplest terms, on the earthly level, evil has won. But on the heavenly level, as God looks at it, evil hasn't won at all. God is controlling everything, and He's bringing everything to its just conclusion according to His purposes. In the book of Daniel, the apparent triumph of the pagan states is the victory of evil. Israel is no longer an independent kingdom. The Davidic monarchy has fallen. Jerusalem is in captivity. The Jewish people are in captivity, or later they are released at the last parts of Daniel once we're in the Persian Empire period, but still they're under Persia. And of course you have the series of the 4 beasts, or before that the 4 parts of the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. These great pagan empires that dominate the world, where Israel is a small province, completely subject to these world powers. So evil seems to have triumphed. In the book of Revelation, you have the victory, or the power of the persecution under the beast. The beast is persecuting, crushing the people of God, and you have that as the earthly reality. Above it, you have the heavenly reality that John sees, that God is in control of all things. So, again, the basic similarity, the basic issue is 2 levels. Well, what do you have in the book of Job? Well, you begin with a look at heavenly reality, the discussion between God and Satan. And then you have the earthly reality, that evil and chaos appear to have triumphed. A righteous man has had horrible calamities fall upon him. And in his discussions, in his speeches, Job will talk about, look around you. Everywhere you see the wicked thriving. You see people suffering horribly. Evil is everywhere. So, on the earthly level, it's like the whole world is in chaos and topsy-turvy. But in the heavenly level, and again you get this especially finally in God's speech, God is in control of everything. So it is the earthly level versus the heavenly level. 2. The heavenly messenger. The heavenly messenger. In the book of Daniel, of course, Daniel is visited by various angels who reveal things to him. Daniel has visions and he has interpreting angels. In the book of Revelation, John is visited first by Christ himself, then he's taken up to heaven and he has kind of a guidance by angels through heaven. At various parts he will interact with angels and ask questions. So you have the heavenly messenger who gives profound secrets or teaching to the central character. In the book of Job, you have 2 such events. Chapter 4 again, Eliphaz describes the spirit who visited him in the night. And then, of course, you have the great revelation to Job himself. Again, Job 38 to 41. So you have the heavenly messenger. 3rd, I guess I would call this the behind-the-scenes battle. As a simple way of summarizing it, it is the realization or the revelation that behind earthly conflicts is a heavenly conflict. In the book of Daniel, you have reference to these kind of conflicting angels who prevent an angel from coming to Daniel, chapter 10, verse 13. The greatest portrayal of this is, of course, Revelation chapter 12, the vision of the dragon and the lady, so that you have this persecution that's going on earth, but behind that is the dragon who has been cast out of heaven by the archangel Michael after a battle in heaven. Well, what do you have in Job? You have the fact that the background to all the conflict that Job is experiencing and his suffering and his subsequent battle with his 3 friends is a conflict between God and Satan. Satan says to God, if you take away all he has, he will curse you to your face. So it is a challenge that Satan issues to God, which results in the conflict and the battle and the debate that rages on earth between Job and his friends. 4th, we could call the undoing of earth. The apocalyptic undoing of earth. Where everything is, like the present creation, is kind of brought into a cataclysmic destruction, a cataclysmic end. So you have, for example, in the book of Daniel, at the end of the book, chapter 12, if I can grab it real quick here. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who is in charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble. This is chapter 12, 1-3. Such has never been since there was nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one whose name shall be found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting ruin. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So you have kind of an apocalyptic end there in the book of Daniel. But again, the strongest parallel is in the book of Revelation, where you have the heavens and the earth are rolled up like a scroll. And you have a new heaven and a new earth. So it really is the end of all heaven and earth, and the making of a new heaven and a new earth. Well, what do you have in the book of Job? Well, what you have in the book of Job, and we're going to talk about this more in detail later, but you may have already read the articles on it. Job chapter 3 again. When Job curses the day of his birth, just to summarize it very briefly, he uses a lot of the language of Genesis 1. And he is basically reversing Genesis 1. And he's calling for everything to be brought down into darkness, and for, as it were, for the world to end. And so it is an undoing of creation that is kind of embedded in the curse on the day of his birth. So the undoing of the earth. Number 5, special numbers. Now don't worry about writing these down. I'm just going to rattle off a bunch of these for you. But apocalyptic tends to deal in special numbers, especially the numbers 3 and 7. So, for example, Daniel tells of 3 righteous men. Daniel 6:10 says Daniel prayed 3 times. The bear of Daniel 7:5 has 3 ribs in his mouth. 3 horns fall from before the little horn in chapter 7, verse 8. Daniel mourns and fasts for 3 weeks. Nebuchadnezzar is insane for 7 periods of time. The apocalyptic chronology takes place over a period of 77s. Revelation has 7 churches, 7 lampstands, 7 stars, 7 seals, a lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes, 7 trumpets, 7 peals of thunder, 7,000 slain in the holy city, a beast with 7 heads and 7 crowns, 7 plagues, a city of 7 hills and 7 kings, and 7 angels with 7 bowls of wrath. That's all in Revelation. It also has 3 angels with 3 plagues that kill 1/3 of humanity, 3 frog-like demons, the breakup of the great city into 3 parts, the heavenly city with 3 gates at each of its walls. What about the book of Job? Job has 7 sons and 3 daughters. The Chaldeans attacked him in 3 bands. 3 friends come to the suffering hero. They sit in silence for 7 days. The ensuing debate has 3 rounds of dialogue. In his final speech, Job lists 14 sins he has not committed, obviously twice times 7. God rebukes the 3 friends. Job intercedes for them with the sacrifice of 7 bulls and 7 rams. The narrative prologue and epilogue, the thematic verb barak, which means to bless, but is euphemistically used for the word curse. In other words, when it says curse God and die, it's actually the verb barak, which means to bless, but it's used as a euphemism. Anyway, this verb is repeated 7 times. The number 7 itself appears 7 times in the book of Job. So again, this heavy emphasis on the numbers 3 and 7 in Daniel, in Revelation, and in Job. 6. I'll just describe this briefly as hard to understand. Apocalyptic literature acknowledges that it is hard to understand. I guess the most famous example of this actually comes from a little apocalypse given by Jesus himself, the Olivet Discourse. Matthew 24:15 inserts the little phrase, "Let the reader understand." Revelation 13 says similarly, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast." Daniel is replete with mysterious revelations which must be interpreted. Either Daniel himself, by a gift of God, will understand it, like the writing of the wall, or Daniel must have a heavenly messenger come and explain to him what's going on. The book of Daniel ends, chapter 12, verse 10, with the claim that the perceptive will understand, but implying others will not. But what do we have in the book of Job? Well, this is something that I'll have to explain in detail later, but I'll just give you the basic idea right now. The Elihu speeches. The Elihu speeches, remember, after the three have finished their debate with Job, they've stopped speaking. Job gave his last final speech. Suddenly, out of nowhere, this guy Elihu pops up. And in chapters 32 to 37, he gives a speech. The text tells us at the beginning, Elihu was trying to make sense of everything that had gone on. He was frustrated. He heard what the three said. They condemned Job, but couldn't really make a convincing case. He was angry at Job, and he was trying to figure it all out. So the figure of Elihu himself is someone trying to make sense of this difficult debate. 7. Strange beasts. Apocalyptic literature routinely uses fantastic and unusual animals. Often they are composite animals. Daniel 7 has a lion with wings, a lopsided bear, a leopard with 4 wings, and the fourth beast, which is just an indescribable monster. He's not really likened to anything. Daniel 8 has a ram that is defeated by a one-horned goat. Revelation has a whole menagerie of all kinds of strange beasts, such as, for example, the locusts that come up from the abyss, who have all kinds of strange features like lion, the hair of a woman, all this sort of thing. What about Job? Well, first of all, in God's speech, God begins by talking about all kinds of animals, and these are natural animals. In chapter 38, he talks about ravens, he talks about lions, he talks about goats, he talks about wild oxen, he talks about just any number of beasts. But then he talks about behemoth in chapter 40 and Leviathan in chapter 41. And in his description of behemoth and Leviathan, they are like some kind of composite beast. They have all these strange and conflicting characteristics, very similar to the beasts you have in Daniel in that sense and Revelation. 8, and I would just describe this with the one word, intermission. Apocalyptic literature will sometimes have a sort of doxological intermission, a praise intermission that sort of interrupts everything and kind of releases the tension and pulls back a little bit. You have, for example, in Daniel 6, 26 and 27, a decree. Daniel 6, 26 and 27. Let me find that real quick. This is, of course, after the lion's den episode, and Darius issues an edict. He says, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominions people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel." And then you have this little poem. "For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lion's den." So right in the middle of everything, and actually almost the dead center of the book of Daniel, you have this little poem that is a praise to God. Now it's part of Darius's decree, but it still stands out as this little poem of praise, this little doxology in the dead center of the book of Daniel. In the book of Revelation, it doesn't come at the center. Actually, you have various kind of praise doxologies that sort of interrupt the flow of things, but they are there for a purpose. They are there to make the point that God is in control of everything, that even though evil seems to be triumphant, God is still ruling. So, you have passage after passage where the 24 elders throw down their crowns and they sing a hymn of praise. The 4 living creatures sing a hymn of praise. Revelation chapter 19, verses 1 to 10 is a great hymn of praise. But they kind of interrupt all the activity with this poem of praise. What do you have in Job? Right in the middle of the book. As I'll argue structurally, the middle of the book, chapter 28, the poem in praise of wisdom. Have all of these debates between Job and the 3 friends. After that, you have the big speech of Job and the speech of Elihu and the speech of God. Right in the middle of it all, you have this poem about wisdom, praising wisdom. So I think it has that kind of function. And 9. How would I describe this? Probably in terms of victory. I guess that would be the simplest term to use. Victory. In the book of Daniel, the domination of the world by the imperial powers comes to an end when God establishes His kingdom. A great rock strikes the foot of the image, it falls, it crashes to the ground, and a great mountain grows up as the kingdom of God. In Revelation, victory comes when basically Jesus, described as the Word of God, riding on a white horse, goes out and destroys the beast. Well, in Job, you have this titanic struggle that is really between Job and his 3 friends, and then Elihu jumps in. But it all comes to an end when God speaks. As soon as God comes and speaks, understanding what he's saying here is something we're going to have to wrestle with, but as soon as God shows up and He speaks, Job says, well, I just shut my mouth. And the 3 friends are actually rebuked, but the debate is over. The battle just ends abruptly with the victory of God in God's speech. 10. And I would describe this, I guess, in one word as encouragement. And this is really the purpose. In my view, the fundamental purpose of apocalyptic literature is to encourage the faithful. Again, apocalyptic, the basic idea, as I understand it, of apocalyptic is reality on 2 levels. The earthly level where evil is triumphant, the heavenly level where God is in control of everything. He knows what He's going to do, and evil will be defeated. With that perspective, the whole point is to encourage the faithful. Now, in Daniel, this is, I think, pretty straightforward. Israel is downcast. Israel is a province of world empires. But there's the promise that ultimately the kingdom of God will be victorious and people should persevere and be faithful. In Revelation, whatever your theology of Revelation is, I think at least you can say it deals with persecution and the fact that evil appears to be triumphant, and people should maintain their fidelity to Christ, should hold on to the word of their testimony, knowing that ultimately the kingdom of God will be triumphant, and the beast and the powers of this world will fail. So its purpose ultimately is to encourage fidelity. In the book of Job, what do you have? You have this great idea of undeserved suffering. Again, theodicy. The idea that wickedness is triumphant everywhere. You can look around and you can see really evil people who are doing great. And you can see good people to whom horrible things happen. And you wonder, where is God in all of this? And the basic idea of it, we're going to explore it all in much more detail later, but the basic idea is encouragement to be faithful. To give you a little preview of this, the poem, The Wisdom. When you read through the whole poem of wisdom in Job chapter 28, you come to the end of the poem. And what is wisdom? What is the core of wisdom in that poem? The end of the poem. Fear God and turn away from evil. No matter how the world looks, no matter how triumphant evil appears to be, the answer is still fear God and turn away from evil. So it is the encouragement to fidelity. Finally, 11, the outcome. Apocalyptic concludes with the faithful having entered bliss. In Daniel, there is this vision of a new heaven and new earth, and the righteous shining like the stars in heaven. The beasts have all been slain. The great image, the kingdoms, the four kingdoms are destroyed, and the kingdom of God reigns. Of course, in Revelation, again, Jesus puts an end to the power of the beast and Satan, and finally there is a new heaven, a new earth, a new Jerusalem, a tree of life, eternal glory, eternal bliss. Well, you don't have eternal glory, eternal bliss, although you do have some talking about resurrection in Daniel and in Job. In Job, we'll get to that. But you do have this. How does the book end? God restored everything to Job so that his prosperity at the end was greater than it had been before. Job once again has 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he ends his life, he lives a very long life, 140 years, twice the allotted age of 70 years. And so Job ends with a faithful, again, it's not heaven, but it is this kind of ideal outcome for him. So I've drawn all these parallels between Job and apocalyptic. What do I make of this? Well, what I make of this is how we need to understand the book of Job as we read through it. And again, I go back to my fundamental definition. Job is about the fact that there are 2 realities. There is what we see around us in this world, and there is the heavenly reality where God is. And God knows everything that's going on down here. And He's in control of it all. Nothing is taking Him by surprise. He will bring everything to its proper conclusion. And to anticipate my conclusion about the book of Job, just briefly, with a hint, we'll get to this in much more detail, God will finally deal with Leviathan. So basically, the whole point of Job is to encourage the faithful to perseverance and understanding that God is in control. That's the basic point of it. Now, in terms of genre, do I call the book of Job apocalyptic? Well, all I say is it's got a lot in common with apocalyptic. In fact, Job has a lot in common with many different types of biblical literature, as we've just seen. In reality, within the Bible, Job is kind of a book unto itself. No other book is really like Job. But I think if you see these parallels, you have a much better sense of how to deal with Job and what to do with it. Okay, let's think about the date of the book of Job. A couple of you have asked me about this, so I'm going to give you a little bit on this, just in so much as I have any ideas about it. Let me begin with something that you have no doubt heard and, maybe have been thinking this is the gospel truth or something like that. Is the idea that the language of Job is really, really archaic and obscure. That it is a very old form of Hebrew and therefore implies that the book of Job is an old book. In fact, there's kind of a traditional view that the book of Job is the first book of the Bible, first book ever written. Well, as far as the Hebrew is concerned, I can tell you that is absolutely not true. The Hebrew of Job is not archaic. The prose that you have in Job 1 and 2, and then in Job 42, that is just standard biblical Hebrew. That is as ordinary a Hebrew as you would ever look at. The poetry is a very high level of poetry. And being high poetry, it has two characteristics. One, it has an extremely extensive vocabulary. Great poets always have huge vocabularies that they draw on. The closest example to this in the Bible is Song of Songs. Song of Songs, of course, is called the Song of Songs, which means the greatest song, the greatest poem. And it has, again, enormous vocabulary. Just all kinds of words. It's not because it's an extremely old book. It doesn't date to 2000 BC. It's Solomonic. But it shows this enormous power of a great poet with great vocabulary. The other thing about great poetry is it can be a little obscure. It can use words in a very unusual way, in a clever way. It can make its sentences very short. It can leave words out. And again, when you read Shakespeare, if you read the sonnets of Shakespeare, they're great poetry by a master poet, and they're often a little hard to follow. And it's the same thing with Job. It is great poetry by a master poet, and so you really have to struggle sometimes to follow what he's doing. But the Hebrew is not specifically archaic. It is very standard Hebrew, even in the poetry. It just has a very high vocabulary and a poetic style. So you really can't do anything in terms of dating the book with its language. Now, some scholars, more critical scholars, have argued that the language of Job implies that it is very late, because they have looked at various words that look similar to Aramaic. Aramaic, language of part of Daniel, and eventually the Jewish people came to speak Aramaic as sort of their mother tongue. You know, when Jesus was born, most people in Judea and Galilee spoke Aramaic. So people would say, okay, well, there are all these Aramaic type words, they're called Aramaisms, in the book of Job, and therefore the book of Job is very late. But that's not really correct either. Such Aramaisms as exist reflect a language that lasted for millennia. And really, among critical scholars such as Sau, S-E-O-W, he's the most recent guy to write a really major commentary on Job. In fact, it's only half finished right now, but S-E-O-W, Dr. Sau, has produced the first of his 2-volume commentary on Job. He has extensive introduction. He talks about the language, and he says basically, the language doesn't tell you anything about the date of the book. It could be a later book in terms of its language. It could be an earlier book. It's a wash. So you really can't conclude anything from the language of the book. Some people do argue that the book of Job is a late book based on other considerations. And again, Sau does this. I'll give you his name, C.L. Sau. Again, he has the most recent, really massive commentary on Job that is only half out now. He's from Princeton University. He argues, for example, that the book of Job is dated to around the 5th century BC, based primarily, or one of his principal arguments is where in Job chapter 1, Chaldean raiders attacked Job's property and family. Chaldeans, like the Chaldeans who ruled Babylon. He says that the raid on Job's property had the quality of a military operation. That is, seems to be an organized event, not just a random mob. And he compares this to the situation of the Chaldeans under Nabonidus. Now, let me put these words down. We're talking about a people called the Chaldeans. Remember, these are the people who ruled Babylon when Jerusalem was destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar II, the ruler of Babylon who destroyed Jerusalem, he was a Chaldean. And the book of Daniel, Daniel is living in Babylon among the Chaldeans. And you had a king named Nabonidus, who was a Chaldean, who lived in the lifetime of Daniel. But Daniel doesn't deal much with him. He deals much more with his successor, Belshazzar, who was also a Chaldean. And Nabonidus was actually not dead at this time. He was still alive. He had left Babylon, and he had left Babylon in charge of Belshazzar. Belshazzar was a co-regent with his father Nabonidus. Nabonidus had gone down south toward the direction of Arabia, and he conducted all kinds of investigations and expeditions in the area with troops under his command. He became actually a devotee of the moon god Sin, and he was restoring temples down there and so forth. But he was down there with his troops. This is Nabonidus. And so Sau, in his commentary, says, well, when Job's family is attacked, it's kind of reminiscent of the Chaldeans and how they were kind of under Nabonidus wandering around in Arabia and northern Arabia, Edomite territory, all that territory. And he says, perhaps the author of the book of Job took this experience of Nabonidus with his troops and he used that as the basis for the story of Job. Well, without getting into all the details of his argument, let me make this point. Yes, Job refers to Chaldeans. We know, though, that the Chaldeans lived in southern Babylon from at least the 9th century BC. Again, we have historical records from outside the Bible going back to at least the 9th century BC and probably earlier. So reference to Chaldeans does not require a date as late as the 6th or 5th century BC. Also, there's no evidence that troops under Nabonidus were out engaging in brigandage, that they were out plundering people and attacking people. They were the imperial power. Typically, imperial powers just tax people. They don't need to carry out raids. And there's no evidence that Nabonidus or his troops did this kind of thing. And in fact, Job does not require a sophisticated military operation. Again, according to Sal, when you read Job 1:17 and the attack of the Chaldeans on Job's family and his possessions, it reads like a military operation. I would say no, it doesn't. I would say even desert raiders, even they're just, if in effect, a band of desert pirates, they're not going to go out and just be totally disorganized and helter-skelter when they carry out an attack. They will carry out an organized attack. They don't need to be under a king to do that. So my point here is, I think Sal's argument is very weak. That there's really nothing in the book of Job that connects it to the 5th century or the 4th century, as scholars are prone to do. You should know that critical scholars typically, I don't know why, they always tend to want to put all the wisdom books in like the 5th or 4th or 3rd century BC. They want to date them as late as possible. So the final version of Proverbs, they date to, very late. Ecclesiastes is always treated as a post-exilic book. And Song of Songs is always treated as a post-exilic book. When in fact, when you look at the evidence, there's nothing specifically post-exilic about any of these books. They just always kind of reflexively do that. So I think the standard argument for placing Job in the post-exilic era is very weak. Now, one argument that is kind of substantial that we probably should deal with a little bit is the argument from the figure of Satan. What does Satan say? What does the presence of Satan say about Job, about the date of the book of Job? Well, the standard view that you'll read in many commentaries, more critical commentaries especially, but not just critical commentaries, is that the idea of a specifically named kind of arch-evil demon, namely Satan, does not emerge until fairly late in Israelite literature. So, for example, in 1 Chronicles 21:1, now, 1 Chronicles 21 1 Chronicles is a post-exilic book. And 1 Chronicles 21 attributes David's census of the nation to Satan. When you read the parallel text in 2 Samuel 24, Satan is not mentioned. So the idea is, well, the whole idea of Satan is a later development. And since Job speaks specifically of Satan, it's probably a later book. There is also, however, another argument that you see referred to very frequently in the literature. In the book of Job, where we translate it as Satan, in Job chapter 1 and 2, the Hebrew text actually says Ha-Satan, namely the Satan, or perhaps simply the enemy, the adversary. In other words, people say, well, this is not a proper name. He has not yet, so to speak, the idea of Satan has not yet evolved to the point that even as a proper name, he's just called the adversary, the enemy. And so, again, the argument is, very briefly, that first the idea of a singular arch enemy of God, namely Satan, is a late development, and that in the book of Job, even though Satan appears, he doesn't really even appear as Satan, Satan, but he appears as Hasatan, the adversary. So it's not even a proper name yet. Thus, again, the typical conclusion is that the book of Job is a post-exilic book, probably fairly early post-exilic. Again, Sal dates the book to the 5th century BC. So what should we think of this? How should we deal with this? Well, I would say a couple of things in particular about this issue. First, the idea of Satan, although it's true, we don't have the term explicitly until a fairly late book like 1 Chronicles 21. We should recognize at least that's an argument from silence. What I mean by that is, over against the whole of Israelite society and religion and culture, the Old Testament is really a pretty small body of texts. And there's a lot, no doubt, that was going on in the ordinary conversation, the religious life, the people that we're not familiar with. The idea that they had no concept of kind of a great demonic figure, frankly, is difficult to fathom. Because in all the other ancient Near Eastern religions, the idea of demonic enemies of people is very common. So again, the idea that there wasn't one at all seems very strange. If you imagine, say, that in the 10th century BC, in ancient Israel, they had no concept of the great demonic enemy, that would make them different from everybody else in the world at that time. And so I think that's quite surprising. Just a moment, I'll get to you. The other thing is the name the Satan. Well, in fact, it is a name. It's not just the adversary. It's an actual proper name, the Satan. How do I know that? I know that because it's used in Zechariah chapter 3. Zechariah chapter 3, 1 and 2. Satan appears and he is accusing Joshua the priest, Joshua the high priest. And the angel of the Lord says, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan." But the term he uses is Hasatan, the Satan. He uses it clearly as a proper name. So even in the book of Job, so even the term Hasatan, the Satan, basically the Satan, Hasatan, and simply Satan, Satan, they're just two versions of the same proper name. So my response is basically in two parts. Part one, every ancient Near Eastern people had the idea of the demonic evil beings. It would be very strange if the Israelites did not have one. Secondly, we know that Hasatan is in fact a proper name. So I would suggest that the book of Job could be written much earlier. And it could refer to Satan by one of the forms of his name, Hasatan, the Satan. And it just so happens, the way things work out, this is the earliest place in the Bible where he appears. Okay, go ahead.
Why is there this sort of prejudice against Israel as opposed to all the other ancient Near Eastern people, that they have such an underdeveloped theology, cosmology, the Satan being an example of that? Everybody knows about demons except for the Jews.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's very strange. And again, there's just a strange prejudice to pushing. It's true of a lot of literature of the Old Testament, but it's certainly wisdom literature. There's just a strange prejudice for pushing everything into the post-exilic, as if, They never reflected on these things until then. So I don't know why there is, but it's there. So, okay, I do want to say one more thing, though, about the date of the book. And that has to do with those ancient Near Eastern parallels I mentioned. There are significant and striking parallels between the book of Job and at least two of the extant books that we've looked at. Ludl Bel Nemeki, I Will Praise the Lord of Wisdom. Some of the material I read, we mentioned that it's quite similar to the book of Job. And also the Babylonian Theodicy, where the sufferer and his friend have this dialogue. The format, obviously, just a moment, has something in parallel. You have a dialogue between the sufferer, who is kind of rebellious, and the friend, who's trying to persuade him. And some of the actual arguments are similar, where the sufferer talks about, I see evil around me everywhere, evil is triumphant, I'm going to give up, I tried being pious, it didn't work, and so forth. Now here's my point. Those books are all 2nd millennium BC. They're all in Akkadian, or prior to that, Sumerian, cuneiform. A language very few Hebrews would have ever learned. Remember, by the time Israel became a great power, the Davidic monarchy and the divided monarchy after that, the international language was Aramaic, which was a language that the Jews could quickly learn and speak. It did not require learning cuneiform, which is very obscure. The mastery of Akkadian cuneiform writing, even in Babylon or in Nineveh, was the province of a few highly trained scribes. So the question is, when is it likely that Israelite or Jewish people would come into contact with this literature and be able to read it, to really be aware of it, to really interact with it? Is it likely in the post-exilic period? In the post-exilic period, Jerusalem was a little backwater. It was a tiny city. It was a very small province in a very great empire, and such, if you want to use the word scholarship, as they had were basically Hebrew scribes, like Ezra. How likely is it that out of that environment you found somebody who was able, first of all, to even be aware of these texts? These texts were very ancient. And by the time of the post-exilic period, the great library of Nineveh had been burned to the ground. How likely is it that a Jew living in this little tiny burned out backwater called Jerusalem would be able to find and wrestle with, read these ancient cuneiform texts? Well, if you go back in time, you come to Israel's glory days, certainly like the Solomonic period, in which Israel had international contacts all over the known world, and in which people came and went specifically for what we might call, I don't know if academic is the right word, but certainly with an awareness of exchanging wisdom. The episode, of course, that's mentioned in the Bible is the visit of the Queen of Sheba. But you have very strong evidence for this was the golden age of Israel. When Solomon himself was the great wise king and the patron of wisdom, and you have all these international contacts, which period is more likely to have generated someone who would know this material? I would argue, far and away, it should be the earlier period. So based on the parallels, I would suggest that the book of Job is an earlier book, and by early, I would tend to date it roughly to the Solomonic period. But that's, that's my educated guess. I'm basically, my basic evidence is the fact that the book shows this awareness of this vast ancient Near Eastern literary tradition. Go ahead.
Based on what you said, that the book of Job was written in Hebrew, correct?
Yes.
Would it be possible, it says in verse 1 that there was a man from the land of Uz. Would it be possible that Job is, I don't know if Job is part of the Abrahamic descendants, probably not. I don't know if I'm correct.
Well, the land of Uz, that's kind of a mysterious thing of itself. Typically, it's thought to refer to the region, it's outside of Israel. I should just say that first of all. The Job never refers to the nation of Israel. There's no reference to Israel, to any Israelite person in the book of Job. The land of Uz is generally thought to be somewhere down in Edom. And so that's as much as we can say. Now, of course, Edom in the Solomonic period was part of Solomon's empire. So that could be significant, but that's as much as we know about that. Okay? Yes?
So even though you think that the book was composed around the Solomonic period, when do you think the actual events of Job happened?
I mean, that's very difficult to say. And I really, I don't have a theory on that. That's just like, that's something, the book gives absolutely no, well, it talks about the Chaldeans, and you could make an argument around that, but the book just doesn't give any chronological indicators. It's not like when such and such ruled the East, or when such and such was king over such and such a land, like you have all over the place in the Bible, where you have named events, and there's just no evidence there. So go ahead, back at the back.
Is there any dating understanding from the name of God and Loa that's used often?
The question is, it relates to the fact that in the book of Job and the dialogues, God is almost always referred to as Eloah, which is an older term, or different term for God, I should say, not necessarily older. I mean, the standard Hebrew biblical term for God, which does appear in Job, is Elohim. And you also have in the book of Job, the divine name, Adonai, Yahweh, the Lord. But very frequently God is called by this term Eloah. I don't know that really tells us much about dating. I think it probably gives it it's a more Gentile and a more universal setting. In other words, the Hebrews typically referred to God as Elohim. Eloah is more of kind of a generic term for God, a sort of universal term for God. And as I said, the book of Job is not set within Israel and makes no mention of any Israelite person or place or thing. And so it really contextualizes it as relating to the whole ancient Near Eastern understanding of God. And again, in the ancient Near Eastern world, we should understand, even though they routinely spoke of gods and goddesses and of all the rituals associated with the gods and the goddesses and their myths, they did have a general understanding of God. And as even some of the excerpts I read, they use the term God. And if you've ever read even like Plato, 5th century BC Greece, he will often refer to God. Not Zeus or Apollo or anything like that, God. So you do have this broad general understanding of God throughout the nations. And I think that's what Eloah refers to. Yes?
What about the idea of Job's age being possibly akin to that of Abraham and the era around him?
It's possible, because Job lived to be 140 years. So you can say, okay, well then obviously Job is kind of like Abraham. He lived a really long time. The other thing is that makes me a little hesitant about pushing that too much is his longevity is specifically a reward of God. So, he restored his wealth more than he'd had before. He was able to replace all of his children, so to speak. And he lived 140 years. So I think the main point is this was like a work of God rather than, he necessarily of himself would have lived 140 years. So I don't know that we can make a whole lot of that.
So his wife would have as well, right?
For him, in order to live a long time, obviously his wife had to live long. Again, it's analogous to Sarah, but again, even Sarah's fertility was an act of God. So, go ahead.
You were mentioning that the author of the book must have been aware of the circadian rhythms. Could it have been the other way around? That the circadian rhythms were aware of the book of Job and then...
Well, I'll tell you why I don't want to go that way, why I would not want to go that way. First of all, I think Job refers to things that are in the Bible consciously. I think Job 3 alludes to Genesis 1. So that the author of Job knows Genesis 1. Whereas there's a place where Job, in my opinion, clearly seems to know Psalm 8, the Psalm of David. So the fact that he's alluding to these texts, to me, again, places him more like in the Solomonic period or later. I would say the Solomonic period. But the other thing is, and this is not so much evidence as it is why I think it's helpful in terms of interpreting the book. I think when you recognize the Akkadian and Sumerian texts as prior to Job and as an established kind of genre as literature, and realize that Job is writing against that, it makes sense. But it doesn't make sense for the others to have picked up the book of Job and have written a book against Job, because I don't think it would work that way. Go ahead.
I was curious where your thoughts were on Job's possessions making him the greatest of all the people of the East, and just how certain cultures in certain time periods that would actually seem to make the most sense.
I don't know that how we can, if you're asking can we use that for dating purposes, I don't know that we can. Yeah, I just, honestly, I think that's the kind of language you see in the Bible generally to say he was really, really rich, he was so rich, he was famous. I think that's basically what it means. Go ahead.
How is it that there can be a reference to a sacrificial system that, like with Job sacrificing for his sons and daughters, that doesn't really line up with the Torah, but then Job can reference...
Well, you remember that sacrifice predates the giving of Torah, the Sinai covenant. Noah sacrificed, Abraham sacrificed, and it was a widely understood practice as far back as we can go. So there's nothing to indicate that Job was making sacrifices in accord with the Levitical system. If he was, he would have had to gone to the central shrine. He would have had to gone to Jerusalem. And there's no indication of that. So it's just sacrifices of themselves are universal in the ancient Near East. And as I say in the Bible itself, they predate the regulations of the Sinai covenant. They predate the Aaronic priesthood, so that a man who is not in any sense a priest, like a Levite or an Aaronite, can offer sacrifices. Okay? Yes?
Of the idea that some of the place names have Abrahamic connections. I've heard that as one of the arguments for putting the patriarch period.
I'm not aware that there's anything that you can pin, say this is like Abraham's sojourns, and therefore I'm just not aware of that. So place names in the ancient Near East, for that matter, they tend to endure a long time. There are Arabic names in Israel today that go back to like the early Bronze Age. They've changed a little, but they're still basically the same name. So names, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in names. Go ahead.
You mentioned that Job borrowed from Psalm 8, it seems like. Is there any reason why Psalm 8 could not be borrowing from Job?
Well, I should remember the verse off the top of my head, but the reason to me it looks like Job is using Psalm 8 rather than the other way around. You know, Psalm 8, what is man that you are mindful of him? And it speaks very positively of God watching over humanity. God elevates humanity. God is mindful of us. He has treated us as the greatest of all the creation and all that sort of thing. So it's very, very positive. Job's use of it is extremely negative. He says, what is man that you are mindful of him? And then he says, you know, God, you never give me any peace. You are constantly hounding me. You constantly got your eye on me to punish me and so forth. It seems surprising that the psalmist would take something so negative and write something so positive. It's more likely that someone would take something positive and in anger and suffering and all that, use it in a very negative way. So you can't prove it, but to me, intrinsically, it's more likely. Go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify, when you say about allusions to Genesis 1, do you mean that Job himself knew the book of Genesis, or the author?
That's an interesting question. I guess you could say that, but I mean, just in terms of if all you're wanting to do is say, okay, what evidence do we have to date the book? And if we can just confine it to that question, then you look at the evidence of the book of Job, where he makes all of these passing allusions to the creation narrative in Genesis 1. I mean, it just seems to me very unlikely that the book of Job was written before Genesis 1. Because again, Genesis 1 is very clear, explicit. Here's this, day 1, day 2, this happens, this happens, this happens. Whereas Job is it's elusive, it's alluding. You know, it just hints at this and hints at that and refers to this and refers to that. So typically the one who's making allusions and that sort of language is the one who comes later.
And then the second question, close to that. The story of Joseph in Genesis, the story of Abel and sufferings of righteous people or not for sin but for some other purpose. Like how it would look in light of this. If Job knew about this event.
You know, that's a good question as well. I think basically I would say off the top of my head, I've never seen anything that looks like an allusion to or, literary parallel between the story of Joseph and Job or Abel and Job. If there's one, I just haven't caught it. I'm not aware of it. I think I would tend to say two things. First, that they both do deal with a common phenomenon, namely the suffering of the righteous, but that Job doesn't appeal to those stories to resolve the question. Job instead has this great debate between the three friends, which is really focused on traditional wisdom, and then God coming in and God giving his answer. So yeah, I mean, if we were writing it, we could say, well, consider the case of Joseph. He was righteous, but he suffered and so forth. But Job doesn't do that. So again, we just have to take the book as it is. Go ahead.
One of the articles we read says that, the Petty's article says that Job girds his tongue with the language of Jeremiah 20:14 in Job chapter 3. Because Jeremiah 20:14 says, "Cursed be the day on which I was born."
Yeah, now Jeremiah does have that curse on the day of his birth. That case, in my view, when you look at Jeremiah and you look at Job, there's no reason to date one ahead of the other. You don't know. Jeremiah could just as well have been using the motif from the book of Job, or it could have been just kind of a more common motif. But that's a case where when I look at the two, I don't see any reason to I don't see any argument for placing one above the other or before the other. Clearly, they both have the cursing of the day of the birth, but that's all. But gosh, this is a big topic. The topic is the structure of the book of Job. And I don't even know that I want to get into this at this time because it's such a big topic and it's so important. Let me give you just a preview. I'm going to give you a preview that's going to lay out what I think is very important and will enable us better to understand the book. A short version of the structure of the book of Job, I would suggest, looks like this. A, Job's afflictions. And that is, I need to make room to write this, chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 1 and 2. B, Job's first response. And that is chapter 3. Of course, chapter 3 again is the chapter where he curses the day of his birth and he bemoans all of his sorrow and his pains and gets everybody's attention. C, you'll notice I'm indenting these a little because I'm constructing a chiastic structure. You have 3 cycles of debate. And these are chapters 4 to 27. Chapters 4 to 27. D, you have the wisdom poem. And this is chapter 28. Now, going back the other way, this would be C prime. You have 3 major speeches. And this, of course, begins with Job's last speech in chapter 29 and goes all the way to the Lord's speech that ends in chapter 41. So it's 29 to 41. Then you have Job's second response. Which is chapter 42, verses 1 to 9. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But then finally, and that of course is B prime, A prime, Job's prosperity. Whoa. And this is 42:10 to 17. Now, let me unpack this a little bit for you and get to what I think is the significance of it all. And all of this we'll look at in more detail when we look at the specific passages. Job's afflictions, well, that's pretty self-evident, right? Job is a rich man. He has many children. He's very prosperous in every way. Satan has this debate with God, and Job suffers terribly. So you have the story of his afflictions in chapters 1 and 2. You then have Job's first response, which a number of scholars do this, and I think they're right. I put separate from the debate with the three friends, because Job just on his own just blurts out this great cursing of the day of his birth in chapter 3. And the debate doesn't really begin, in my view, until Eliphaz jumps in chapters 4 and 5 and begins to rebuke him. And then they start going back and forth with each other in these three cycles. Now, of course, you know, there are these three cycles of debate. The first two cycles, you have Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and each time Job responds. And then the third cycle, only Eliphaz and Bildad speaks. Zophar doesn't speak, and there's a reason for that I'll get to. But I think very widely acknowledged, you have these three cycles of debate. One of the articles you're going to read, the person argues that there's actually 4 cycles. I don't think that's right, but I'm not going to deal with that right now. So you have 3 cycles of debate, and then we have this wisdom poem in chapter 28, which, as I've talked about, is quite distinctive. It's an interlude. It talks about the fact that this whole business is very hard to understand. People dig and delve trying to find gold and rubies and silver, but they cannot find wisdom no matter how much they dig. So you have this poem that just seems to be dropped in out of nowhere right in the middle of the book. Then chapters 29 to 41, you have the 3 major speeches. You have the big speech of Elihu, and then you have the big speech of God. First you have the big speech of Job, 29 to 31, then the big speech of Elihu, 32 to 37, and then the big speech of God, 38 to 41. So instead of 3 cycles, you have 3 really large speeches by these 3. And then you have what I'm calling here Job's second response. Now this response is already anticipated, I should say, in chapter 40. Job says something similar in chapter 40. But in chapter 42, 1 to 9, God has finished speaking, and Job gives his response, which is, of course, I repent in dust and ashes, which is something we're going to talk about, and you're also reading some articles on that. That's a very important concept. And Job intercedes for his friends, which is a very, very important moment in the book, as we shall talk about. So I think 42, 1 to 9 is very important and is the counterpart to his first response, in which he curses the day of his birth. When he curses the day of his birth, he calls down blackness and oblivion on everything. In the end, he saves the lives of his 3 friends by interceding for them. So it is a radical departure, very different. And then, of course, obviously, the prosperity of Job is in contrast with his prior afflictions. So that's how I think the book is structured. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, typically, in my view, and I'm not unique to this, typically when you have this kind of structure, the center part, the pivot, is the really important thing for you to notice. Doesn't necessarily mean it is the single most important text in the whole book, but it does mean that structurally it calls attention to itself. It is literally pivotal. And I think typically when you have this kind of structure, again, this is a chiasmus, A, B, C, B, A, or in this case, A, B, C, D, C, B, A. When you have this kind of structure, the pivotal central text is in some way a key to interpretation. Now again, we're going to talk about this in some detail later, but the important thing to grasp, in my opinion, is this. It speaks of wisdom as something that we cannot find. Now that, think about it, I'm kind of previewing my interpretation of this passage, but that's okay. Think about it. That is very different from what you have in other passages on wisdom. Proverbs chapter 1, Lady Wisdom stands on the street corner and says, "Here I am, come to me, learn from me, I'm right here." I couldn't be more obvious. There is a kind of wisdom that is everywhere evident. You see it all the time. You know, most anybody will acknowledge that if you are lazy and squander your resources, you're going to ruin your life. Most anyone will acknowledge that if you get heavily into alcohol or start taking recreational drugs, you're going to really wreck yourself. People all over the world know that. It's everywhere. It's evident. That's the wisdom of Proverbs. Lady Wisdom. She's right there. You can't miss her. You have to deliberately turn away from her. The wisdom of Job 28 is obscure. You can dig and delve and search all you want, and you will not find this wisdom. Again, I'm really getting ahead of myself, but it's worthwhile because this is interesting, I hope. There is a wisdom that is beyond us. A wisdom that is incomprehensible to us. Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 speaks of the wisdom of God, which is folly to the wise and the rulers of this world. It is beyond our comprehension. It is, in a word we would use, it is very thoroughly counterintuitive. We would never imagine it. We would never come up with it. And that's what Job 28 is saying. There is a wisdom that is beyond human ability to grasp. It's basically the wisdom of God. The mind of God, the plan of God. Again, the wisdom of the book of Proverbs is what's been put into the world in creation. It's everywhere. The wisdom of God is in the mind of God. And so, what Job 28 is saying is there is a kind of wisdom that no amount of human learning or debate or theological reflection will ever uncover. It is what God Himself intends to do with evil and how God will deal with it. And for that, there's nothing you can do but wait upon God. And thus the text ends with saying, well, here's wisdom. Fear God and turn from evil. Because in the face of this, when something's happened that is truly inscrutable and is beyond our power to reason out, when God is doing something that we cannot possibly comprehend on our own, the best course of wisdom is just fear God and wait. And again, I'll jump ahead of myself one more time. And I've already alluded to it. What is the great example of this? The great example of this is the cross. We have the wisdom of God dealing with evil in a way no human mind could have ever imagined. We would never have thought this is how God is going to deal with evil. You know, it's beyond human imagining. And so that's what Job basically is driving at. There is a wisdom that is utterly beyond us. And this obviously was very key to God's speech to Job in Job 38 to 41 that we'll go through in detail.